Let's take a look at some of the weapons that the West has sent to Ukraine, as well as those that are expected soon. I'm joined by Air Marshal Edward Stringer, a former Director of Operations at the Ministry of Defence. And Ed, just take us through some of the weapons that the West has already given or pledged to give to Ukraine.
Good afternoon, Jane. Well, no weapon is purely offensive or defensive, but very clearly early on the West was making sure that the weapons it gave were very much at the defensive end of the spectrum. So you have at the top here anti-tank missiles, the NLAW and the Javelin, and here the Starstreak anti-aircraft missile. Only really useful if someone drives a tank or an aircraft into your country and at you. And pledged down here, we have the Sabre, which is the drone, which the Americans have now pledged, but only about 100. And this is essentially, in the bigger version, just a Javelin warhead with a drone that can take it a little bit further than a Javelin can reach on the battlefield. So a little bit more offensive, but still very much at the defensive end of the spectrum.
So these are all things that could be used against Russian military, but they wouldn't be much use to a country if it wanted to invade another country. So therefore Russia could say, or Ukraine could argue that these are purely defensive.
Yes, and the West can say we are helping Ukraine to defend itself against aggression. We are not allowing it to take or sponsoring it to take the fight to Russia or in Russia.
Then the next step, of course, is slightly more offensive. And let's look at some of the things that, again, the West has promised or is sending or has sent so far.
Yes, and what you've got here at the top are weapons that Ukraine already has, and that's important because these weapons need to be kept serviceable, and that means spares, they need to be maintained, and your troops need to know how to use them and get the best out of them. So the Czechs are talking about providing the T-72 tank and the BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicle, and that will be of great help to Ukraine. Down here, the UK has pledged, slightly less offensively, but nevertheless still very useful, protective mobility. And you have the Mastiff and the Jackal, which will allow them to get troops around the battlefield with a slightly enhanced element of protection.
And you've made the point that it's not much use us sending one or two of each. It's much more useful to the Ukrainians if they're sent a lot of one thing so they can focus their knowledge on it and that they have the spares and things for it.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why sending them stuff that they've already got. And you win wars by simplifying, prioritising and then doing it at scale. And the West has to come together to work out how it's going to keep providing this to Ukraine so it doesn't run out of war-winning weapons before Russia does.
And finally, jets. Ukraine has said that they do want planes, they want help. Poland potentially sending these kind of jets. Is that a step too far? Is that then moving on to the offensive line?
Well, that's been a political calculation to date. We mentioned that spectrum of offensive to defensive. And even though the MiG-29 is very much a defensive air defence fighter, it's still got a long range. It could penetrate into Russian airspace. So the calculation so far has been that this would be a step too far, even though the Ukrainian Air Force has been asking for it for many weeks. But I think what we're seeing with some of those tanks and infantry fighting vehicles is that political calculation is beginning to change, and we're moving up that spectrum from defensive to a bit more offensive.
OK, Air Marshal Edward Stringer, thanks very much.
Thank you.